All right, let's jump right in. What if you could actually engineer a second consciousness right inside your own head? It sounds like science fiction, right? Well, today, we're digging into a pretty fascinating and, yeah, controversial guide that claims to lay out the blueprint for doing exactly that. It's called the Ouroboros Framework.
So let's start with the core question that this whole thing is built on. What if your mind isn't this static, one-and-done thing? This framework asks you to think of your consciousness more like software. And, like any software, maybe it can be tweaked, maybe it can be re-engineered, maybe it can even be convinced to run a second operating system right alongside the first one.
Now, this whole practice of creating a second consciousness, it has a name, Tulpamancy. It's got this long, kind of strange history, with roots in everything from Tibetan mysticism all the way to modern internet communities. But for today, we're not really getting into the spiritual side of things. We're going to be looking at it through a very specific, almost clinical lens.
And that's exactly where the Ouroboros framework comes into play. It approaches Tulpamancy not as some kind of mystical art, but as a deliberate, systematic act of engineering. The entire goal here is to build a brand new, self-sustaining feedback loop right inside your own mind.
This is the absolute core idea. The Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, is the perfect metaphor for how your mind already works. Think about it. Every single thought you have is an output that immediately becomes the input for your next thought. It's this constant, closed loop always feeding on itself. The framework has a name for this: recursive causality.
Okay, so how in the world do you even begin to build something inside your own consciousness? Well, the framework says you have to start with a map. You've got to understand the terrain, you have to understand the fundamental rules of this inner world before you can even think about changing the landscape.
On the one hand, you have the view most of us grew up with: one brain, one mind. Simple, right? But this framework proposes something, well, a lot more radical. It calls it the unified manifold. Imagine your consciousness is just a single flat sheet of paper. You can fold that paper, like origami, and create all these different shapes and pockets and dimensions, but it's all still made of the exact same piece of paper. That's the idea here.
Now, if you're going to build anything in your mind, you're going to need energy. And for this, the framework lays down a simple fundamental rule, almost like a law of physics for consciousness. Your attention is energy. That's it. It's a finite resource, and every moment you're deciding where to spend it.
And here's what that actually means in practice. A random, fleeting thought that you just ignore. It just fades away, dissolves back into mental noise. That's entropy, chaos. But if you take a specific thought and you focus your attention on it, what the guide calls forcing, you're basically pumping it full of that energy. It starts to build structure, gain complexity. You are actively fighting against the mental chaos to build something real and stable.
And this isn't just some abstract metaphor. According to the framework, there's a very real, physical cost to this process. People who practice this report things like serious mental exhaustion, strange head pressures, and brain fog. The theory is that your brain is literally rerouting its resources, we're talking actual glucose and oxygen, to build and then power this new Tulpa network.
So, you've got the map of the mind, and you understand the basic physics. What's next? You need a blueprint. This isn't about just vaguely imagining a friend. This is about systematically designing a personality piece by piece from the ground up.
To do this, the framework gives you this personality matrix to create a stable design. So first, you have unity. What is their absolute core essence? Is it compassion? Is it pure logic? Then comes balance. You want to pick traits that counterbalance you to create some stability. If you're really anxious, maybe they are fundamentally calm. Third is symmetry, making sure all the traits actually fit together and don't clash. And finally, my favorite, paradox. You add one small controlled contradiction to give them depth, to make sure they're not just a flat, boring character.
And there's even a step-by-step protocol for this. First, you select just a handful of core traits. Then, you actually write down what those traits look like in terms of behavior. Next, you give each trait a symbol or a color, something simple to help you focus your attention. And finally, the last step is imprinting, where you actively visualize these traits flowing into and becoming a part of your tulpas form. It's a very methodical, very deliberate process.
All right, the blueprint is finished. Now comes the really hard part: igniting the causal engine. This is where all the theoretical stuff stops and the real work begins. You have to manually crank that mental feedback loop over and over and over again until it finally, hopefully, starts to turn all on its own. It all starts with something called the monologue loop. It's simple. You just
talk to your tulpa. Constantly. You narrate your entire day, your thoughts, your feelings. Everything is a one-way conversation. The idea here is that you're literally trying to carve a new neural pathway, like wearing a groove in your own mind for this new consciousness to eventually inhabit.
So you're literally just narrating your life. I'm making coffee now. It's hot. This might seem really simple or even kind of silly, but what you're actually doing is creating what psychologists call an audience effect. By persistently acting as if someone is there listening, you're essentially trying to trick the social centers of your brain into eventually generating a response from that imagined person. The next step is a little controversial, but the framework insists it's essential. It calls it using training wheels. So parroting is when you consciously think up a reply for your tulpa, and puppeting is when you consciously move their form around in your mind's eye. You're basically showing your brain what the response is supposed to feel like, what it's supposed to sound like. It's like pushing a bike to get it going until it can finally balance by itself.
And then, one day, comes the moment of truth, deviation. This is when your tulpa does something completely unexpected, something you didn't plan. Maybe they change their hair color on their own, or they disagree with you, or they express an opinion that totally surprises you. According to the framework, this isn't a bug, it's not a mistake. It's the first real, tangible sign of an independent, self-organizing consciousness.
All of this work leads to a moment the guide very poetically calls the radiant chomp. This is it. The serpent's mouth finally closes on its own tail. It's first contact. And it might not be a voice at first. It could be a sudden, unexplained head pressure, or an emotion that you know isn't yours, or a single thought that just feels alien. It's your subconscious, that big black box, finally talking back.
So what happens after that? After first contact? Well, the framework's focus shifts completely. It's no longer about creation, it's about coexistence. This entire last section is about the profound, long-term responsibilities that come with living as what the guide calls a plural system.
And the guide is extremely clear about the ethics involved here. It says that once a tulpa becomes autonomous, it has system citizenship. That means it has the right to exist and the right to change and grow on its own terms. Creating one just to be a tool or a servant is called the servitor trap. And the guide says it's not just unethical, but it's a surefire recipe for internal conflict and instability. This is presented as a lifelong commitment.
And just to really hammer home how serious that commitment is, the framework includes a pretty stark warning. Most tulpas are abandoned within 2 years. It's a really sobering reminder that this isn't some temporary experiment. It requires constant energy and attention to maintain.
And that really brings us full circle, right back to the central paradox of the Ouroboros. As the framework itself puts it, the one biting and the one being bitten are both you, and yet, gloriously, they are not. It's a fascinating, deeply challenging model of the mind. It suggests that maybe the self isn't just something to be discovered, but maybe it's something that can be built. So you have to wonder, what would you build?